We're live. Yet another Ask Us Anything with a permanent member, Scott. Now there is no escape, Scott. You're here to stay now.
Hello.
It all started like I'm going to join you for one episode, and then I abused it. Anyways, it's
Great to be here.
Yeah, likewise. So okay, let's start. Let's dive straight into questions. No pleasantries and all this stuff. Those are all live questions. We don't have any depth from previous sessions. So, from Elad, what do you think about using Talos Linux today for managing Kubernetes exclusively on-prem? How does it compare to running Kubernetes on other declarative operating systems like NixOS? How experienced are you with Talos, Scott?
I've dabbled with it, and I understand, the idea behind it, but haven't played with it a lot.
Okay, so we're on the same foot here. So I don't know details. I'm not an expert in Talos. Scott doesn't seem to be one either. But what I can say in a more generic terms, if you're talking about Kubernetes nodes, unless you have very special requirements, it's better to use something that is light and designed for Kubernetes than more general operating system like NixOS, right? NixOS is amazing. I love NixOS. But I don't see a good reason why choosing it over Talos.
Yeah, so Talos, I think, in general, it's just going to come down to where it's supported, how it's supported in the distribution you choose. Because Talos does use Ignition, doesn't use Cloud Init, so there's been a lot of challenges. It is already integrated. There was a lot of work to integrate it into different CAPI providers, like cluster API providers, all of that. But it's, there are a lot of challenges that can arise around that. So, in general, it's just make sure that what you need works on it because it is limiting. But yes, container optimized operating systems are a great solution for security.
If you're using cluster, my brain stopped, not cluster API.
Cluster API.
Yeah, cluster API. It's still more likely to work better than or easier than NixOS.
I would never use NixOS in my life. I think that the idea is great and it's just abysmal. Nix packages are a different thing, but NixOS I hate at every level.
We're on the same. I don't hate it necessarily, but packages is the main feature, at least in my head.
Yeah.
I feel like if NixOS came along like 20 years ago, at the time of Ubuntu's of the world, it would be a different thing, right? But now with Kubernetes, I feel that we don't need all that.
Exactly.
Okay, next from Bartomelu, or whatever it's pronounced. Is there a way to do GitHub-based OS configuration, SSH-conf, tuned users management, networking in on-prem environments? And the short answer is, if you find the Kubernetes controller that does it, then the answer is yes.
Exactly. Listen, technically, if we're speaking, if you have a cron job set up in your machine that pulls down from Git and applies it, that is GitOps following the principles of consistent reconciliation with a reconciliation loop that pulls from Git. That's like you could do it. Are there any good tools that do that beyond cron itself in some random bash script? Not that I know of.
And also kind of, you probably want to go towards more immutable stuff, like create a VM image that is mostly ready. Mostly, it will never be 100%, but mostly ready for what you need, instead of, hey, I install Ubuntu and then I SSH into it and then I do this and then I do that. Especially how if you need to do all those things, how will you scale up?
Exactly. Like when you look at even cluster API, for example, there's a tool in the Kubernetes ecosystem called Image Builder that preloads into there all of the Kubernetes binaries, all of that, and all that's injected it through Cloud Init and all of that is just the actual runtime information that you can't bake into it. Like, what is the token for kubeadm? What are the certificates? And that's really the way to work. I think that Ansible with Packer to build your eyes, OVAs in vSphere, QCOW2s if they're on KVM or whatever you are, wherever. Packer is the de facto standard, I think, that should be used for all of these things, and it just makes it much better.
And there is no, at least in my case, I don't see a compelling reason to even try to make that GitHub something, right? You're not talking about state. You're talking about building images.
Exactly.
Just as you're building images for your applications, right?
Exactly.
Okay, next one. This is cool. Keep coming. We have a per service repo. Is it a good idea to put some general cross repo scripts who need to operate on the other repos, like setup on another repo and have the addresses Git submodules? In my case, whenever it's one-to-many relation, you want to separate it, right? So I'm again putting more general answer, kind of, hey, this script should be something that is used in multiple repos or whatever that something is. Yeah, separate it, right? Now, I'm not very fond of submodules. I don't like them at all.
I think they are one of the worst things that could possibly exist. There is a solution to them called Vendir from the Carvel community, which I think actually handles all of those challenges, but in a declarative, easy, good manner. So what I actually do is just have a vendir.yaml file, which configures things. And then when you pull down the repo, instead of doing a git submodules sync, you run a Vendir sync and you're done. And it just does everything in a more declarative way. The benefit of also is it can pull in not just from Git repos, but it can pull in files or things from a bucket or GitHub release artifacts or OCI artifacts. And so you have a lot more flexibility than you do with Git submodules as well.
Exactly. Especially that more often than not, when you think about it, if you want to kind of have everything you need to work on a project, including things that are not specific, exclusive to that project, it's never only Git. Never only Git. Exactly. You will have a CLI that you want to use, right? You will have something. So other ways.
Yeah.
I will go back to the previous comment. In my case, I differ slightly from you, Scott. In my case, that would be NixOS packages, right?
Right. Exactly.
Okay. Main security issues on recently created Kubernetes cluster. That's tough because recently created Kubernetes cluster can be anything.
The main security issue on any Kubernetes cluster are the users using that Kubernetes cluster, not CVs.
That's easy to solve. Just have one admin user. One admin user on a piece of paper in a vault, in a physical vault. You know the one with the dial, just in a break glass situation, and Git.
Listen,
read only is okay.
Right. Listen, I would say the number one security issue in Kubernetes, in my mind, from when you just get started, is the fact that it is basically allow any from a network policy perspective. Networking is just a free for all until you lock it down. So if the question is, I create a new cluster, what is the biggest security thing that you have to deal with? RBAC is in place. So RBAC is already there. There are all of the roles, all of that, and a user needs to be given permissions, and therefore that's not really a security issue. But from a networking perspective, the fact that the default is just allow any, that becomes, I think a major security issue that has to be dealt with early on.
I think that also, I'll put it on a third place. Fat images, right? And when I say images, I don't mean only container images. I mean images of your operating system as well, kind of like fat. Don't put stuff you don't need. And it's not necessarily the biggest security risk, but it's such an easy fix. You don't need Ubuntu as a server. You can use Talos. I'm saying it only because we just mentioned it, right?
Exactly.
Anything else? You don't need Debian as a from statement in container images, or at least most likely you don't.
Right. And yes, there are use cases where you need it. There are use cases where it makes sense. But even when you need Ubuntu, do you really need Ubuntu full? Or can you use the slim Ubuntu images that have ripped out most of the bloatware of Ubuntu itself, right? And then it's like, okay, I can make the use case for that. Obviously, things like Wolfie are, probably the best from a security perspective. Alpine I stay away from just because it breaks too many things due to glibc being replaced with Musel and whatever, and it just causes the weirdest issues. So I always have stayed away from Alpine. I love Wolfie, but also slimmed down Ubuntu is legitimate, I think, just not the full Ubuntu base.
I think that in that area, part of the problem is that due to inertia, right, from before, operating systems like Ubuntu for images ended up being the default choice, and then you need to justify to use something else. And what needs to happen is the other way around, kind of like, let's say you say Wolfie is the base, right? Or whatever you choose,
Right.
something slim. That's the default option. And then you need to justify why you don't use it. And it's okay,
Right.
kind of like there are reasons in some cases why not. But it cannot be the default choice.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it okay to use tools that are new and are under active development, like Argo CD Image Updater? I guess it depends on the area first, right? Because there are areas that are matured and there are areas that are not, right? So you cannot expect something that exists for already 10 years in the area of promotions, right? Because we don't have tools. We don't have many tools to begin with. And then they're all relatively new. And also it depends, my answer also depends on how critical something is, right? I'm more willing to play with Argo CD Image Updater than I'm willing to switch my operating system from Talos. Again, I'm just using it as an example because
Right.
it was mentioned before, to something else,
Yeah.
right? Because the repercussions, I'm not necessarily saying that I will not do that, but I'm going to think twice before I do it.
Yeah. The question is if it's in the critical line or not, right? And I completely agree with that, right? And that's where like Argo CD Image Updater is a nice thing. But what is the worst case if it doesn't work? The worst case scenario is that you didn't get the deployment of the new image just now because it didn't push the new tag up to get it, failed to do that, and you can do it manually as long as you set up logging and all of that. I think that one thing in this is I tend to not recommend installing like these alpha very heavily under like initial development things in production. However, I believe that it is a requirement for any good DevOps team to have a dev cluster where they are testing these things out and seeing how they would fit into their ecosystem. Because when it's under active development, that's when you can make the most impact on the tool also. So install it, test it, see how it would work with your workflows, find issues, raise the issues. If you want to, contribute also with PRs, but create the issues, let them know. Because while it's under active development, that's when all the big changes can be made. Afterwards, it's going to be a much more tedious process to get a direction change into something.
But it's also that, alphas, both as in new projects, but also as in new features of existing projects, they are sometimes, not necessarily always, but often created to solve a problem that somebody has. And then you need to identify, do I have that problem, right? You will see, like Kubernetes, there is alpha of, mutating admission controllers. That's right now in alpha. Is that a problem that you don't have solved right now or not? You ask yourself. And if you say no, I already have tools for that, then it goes straight into your playground for when you have time.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is a follow-up. Argo CD image updater is under active development. I don't know what's happening with, to be honest, with Argo CD image updater. I doubt that Scott does because he's not Argo CD fan in the first place.
My guess is that they're just copying the amazing work that was done by the better GitOps tool Flux CD, 3 years ago.
So from my side, I don't know what is going on right now. I know that Argo CD image updater back in the day, let's say a year ago, the last time I was using it was too rigid for my taste, right? I could not adapt to it. Let me put it that way, right?
Yeah.
Okay, from Ryan, with an XRD, I'm assuming that we are talking about Crossplay now, that defines everything for an application, split control plane and app clusters. Does the GitHub provider make sense to push files to Argo CD to sync when want visibility for devs in Argo CD? So I wouldn't use personally GitHub provider to push files to Git, except maybe, but there are issues with that. I'll get to it later. For the initial repo, kind of like, you have some scaffold as a replacement for, what's the name, Scott? There is GitHub template or something like that. Right?
Yeah, GitHub templates, repo templates.
Yeah,
and all
something
of that,
like replacement for that, right? But once ignoring that initial setup, I mean, you want to, you write something, some code, some YAML, whatever you're doing in your VS Code or whatever you're using, you're pushing it to Git. You don't need Crossplay for afterwards for that.
Yeah, I mean, the one issue that exists also with doing this, like unless you start using like the initial, or there's like the different ways in Crossplay to say only sync this once, but if something changes after, don't delete it and all of that. Do you really want the source of truth to be there and then have to have multiple levels of abstraction of getting the file up and back out? I think it just adds, you don't want reconciliation around files in Git, because those are things that humans change.
And there is also an issue with notoriously tough limits of GitHub API, right? You can easily hit limits if you make too many requests to GitHub, right? Few files doesn't make a difference. Yeah, put 100,000 files over there to be constantly reconciled, meaning constant requests to GitHub, and you might have an issue over there.
Yeah.
Okay, AKS. What is the way to do CICD with Tecton on Argo CD? I couldn't find the image promotion example from dev, QA, prod. Should one build image in dev and in prod pipeline do a scoped, probably copy?
Scopio. No, Scopio is a tool that allows you to copy from one registry to another.
Okay, so a couple of things there. I'm gonna go in the opposite order. If this assumes that ideally you cannot do it always, you build image only once, and you promote the same image from one environment to another. You don't rebuild it from when you move from QA to somewhere else, right? And as how to do promotion, this is now me being an old person kind of that is rejecting change. In your Tecton pipeline, clone the repo, execute YQ, commit and push back to the repo. That's my promotion.
So for me, I have a different approach to this. It's similar, but the way that I view it is you never push a new image, but what you can do is push a new tag. So like in dev, use like -dirty or dash like the git commit, whatever it is, like that you have their -dev.
Yeah, that's same. It's still the same image,
right? Exactly. You push a new tag that goes to QA, so you can have also like regexes in like the Flux CD image auto image updater and the image controller. I don't know about the Argo CD one, but I'm guessing you do as well, where it can watch for images that have that meet a specific regex. So if you had like -dev and -QA and -prod, and that's what your Tecton pipeline was pushing up, then that would work very well, because you could just watch here for dev and that would push up to dev. It would look for QA. It would update that manifest. Same thing for prod. So let the image updater do its work. And what you also do, in my mind, is that you add a signature, you sign your image when it finishes dev, when you're ready for the promotion stage, it actually gets signed with cosign with a dedicated key. That basically means this passed my tests of dev. It goes to QA. Once that finalized, you add the other signature there, and you use Kyverno or the cosign validating webhook to actually validate those signatures per cluster. So it allows you to promote and also validate that the promotion went through the different gates or steps along the way.
There we go. Next one from Nikos. We are on fire today. We are faster than people type. If you have like one Argo for 10 different environments, is it good? Or is it better to split them one master and one per product, let's say? So when I read the first question, I thought that it refers to 10 different clusters. But now I'm doubting that that's the case. So I'm not sure whether... So let's try both cases. 10 different clusters and 10 parts of the same cluster environments, right? And so, I personally, unless we get to certain scale, I prefer each cluster having its own Argo CD. And then you can start later on thinking about Argo CD of Argo CDs or Flux or Fluxes or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Because among other things, you remember what we said early on about security. If I can block my cluster from or disallow anybody and anything to access my cluster, I'm more secure.
Exactly. I in general do not like the, one to rule them all, where like all applications get deployed from one. What I like is Argo CD from one cluster, deploying Argo CD and the initial set of applications into each cluster that then go and reconcile their own apps. That's the way that I typically like to structure things. I do the same thing when it comes to Crossplane, where you have Crossplane in one cluster that actually installs Crossplane and a set of configurations into each cluster that then go and actually do their job, right? Because I think you reach better scale that way. I think having like the Argo that manages Argo or the Flux that manages Flux, you get that same single point of management where you can fan out things to all of your clusters at once. So you get the simplicity of management, while at the same point you get better security, you get better tenancy, you get better performance, because any of these controllers work better when their caches are smaller and when they have to make less API calls. So yeah.
Yeah, I do the same. In my head, and I'm mentioning it because you mentioned it, Crossplane is good to set up the initial cluster. Kind of to have the Argo CD there to start with, but then that cluster bit can be autonomous.
Exactly. Well, and you manage Crossplane with Argo CD in that Crossplane cluster. So
yeah, I mean,
right?
Whether you need Crossplane there or not depends on what you're doing with Crossplane, whether it's mostly for infrastructure or
no. What I mean is you use Argo CD. You use Argo CD to deploy the Crossplane resource that creates the cluster that deploys Argo CD.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
More from Nikos. In the previous live session, you have mentioned to set up limit to CPU doesn't matter because Linux can handle it better. Yes.
Yes.
I think there is a fundamental difference between how memory and CPU work, right? CPU is given to something, right? When I give CPU 1 GB of memory to this process, that process owns it in a way, at least for a while. While CPU is shared all the time, right? And putting limits doesn't make sense. What does make sense is still to put requests, because then you help Kubernetes decide what to do. But it will not without limits, it will not kick it out because of CPU shortage, right? Well, if you don't have enough memory, you need to kick something out. Kind of, there is no way around it.
Yeah. I am a complete believer that you should never set CPU limits. But 50% of the industry believes you should always, and 50% believe you never should. So I get it's, a philosophical debate that exists, but I am of the
Scott,
camp that you never
I think
set
that's a great result. I know that there are things that we believe that only 5% of the industry believes. So
Exactly.
being in the 50% group,
Exactly.
that's such a luxury. Yeah?
Exactly.
Okay, from Matthias, it's hard to make devs cloud native in a large mid-sized company. Forcing Kubernetes, GitOps, 12-factor, etc. down their throat won't help. We have great teams, but many expect platform infra to solve problems. I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that everybody should know everything up to a certain level, kind of on a high level. Kind of, you shouldn't be completely oblivious that you never heard of something called containers, right? So I wouldn't go that far. But it's unrealistic. So it takes years to master Kubernetes. Kind of, I can say that Kubernetes there is no easier way to do what Kubernetes does, but it's still very, very complicated. It's not something you can figure out Docker in a day. You cannot figure out Kubernetes in a day, right?
Yeah.
And I agree. Forcing people to learn Kubernetes, everybody, is not going to work. And I feel that that's where Kubernetes is going right now. That's the next phase. We need to make Kubernetes invisible, meaning that it's there, it's doing the job, but you don't need to go into nitty-gritty details. It's not even designed to do that. Just as I dare hear in audience how many people are still on a daily basis working with hypervisors. Except Scott, right? But I mean,
Exactly.
To me, it's a similar situation like what EC2 is for hypervisors, right? We need hypervisors.
Yeah.
But for majority of people, you just want a VM, you get a VM. You don't need to know the details.
Exactly. I think that in general, right, the idea of platform engineering is that we have to build better abstractions. And as Kelsey Hightower, as I probably mentioned multiple times in the past, but Kelsey always used to say Kubernetes is a great platform for building platforms. It is not supposed to be developer focused. There's a guy, Tekle Tinkle from VMware, now Broadcom. They used to say that giving developers kubectl access is like putting me on an airplane with 1,000 people and telling me, go fly. Right? Like it's not the safest thing in the world. So it's like I would not go about doing that, right? I don't think that giving Kubernetes access and making them learn all these things is the right approach. We have to build the right abstractions, and at the same point, don't create an abstraction that makes it easier, but don't make it so they have no clue what's going on. Give them the visibility into what's going on underneath. If anyone wants to geek out and look at what's under the covers, don't make it a black box that they can't see. But just make it.
You make it in layers, right? You have your abstraction. Maybe you will have another abstraction of yours below that abstraction, and then you will have Kubernetes abstraction. Below Kubernetes abstraction, you will have container abstraction. And below container abstraction, there is operating system abstraction and so on and so forth, right? There are infinite number of abstractions, and you don't remove them, but it's optional, right?
Exactly.
Now, here is a follow-up question from Matthias. Any recommendation to shift their mindset? And I have only two. Either go for a provider that gives you the abstraction, Heroku-like, Google Cloud Run, Fly.io, AWS this or that, Azure this or that. Give them either let people use the abstractions managed by others, or you create and you manage abstractions for them. Kind of those are the two options. It's either you or somebody else.
Exactly. Now, the one thing I will say is that there are certain things that developers do need to become cloud native in. Cloud native, on one sense, is Kubernetes and GitOps and containers and all of this. Those are technologies that are not cloud native. Those are technologies that enable a cloud native application to run well. Actual cloud native practices means like 12-factor app. That is something that a developer has to know. We have to push that on them because that is their responsibility to stop writing logs to files and write logs to std out. It is to write things that are decoupled from one another. It is to use event-driven systems. It is to use message brokers. There are the elements of a 12-factor app that a developer must know and that a developer must implement. Anything that can be abstracted away should be.
Let's take events as example of what you just said, right? A developer should understand how to actually write code of its application to receive or send events, right? But shouldn't know in detail how Kafka works.
Correct.
Right? That's that level of that's what I mentioned before, kind of like you should know a bit of everything about everything and then focus on what is really you. Right. You don't need to don't buy courses for everybody to learn Kafka. Please don't.
No, and that's where things like Dapper and whatnot help to kind of build these better abstractions also from the developer to make it easier. Or just use Nats, Victor's favorite.
Oh, yeah. Exactly. I mean, Nats is more in the way how we just explained it. Whether you use Nats or Kafka, that's not... neither of those two help developers in any form of way. It will help you to provide eventing mechanism to everybody else.
All I can say is that you're nuts if you use Nats, but that's a whole other story.
Okay, I have the other one about you need to have nuts to, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. AKS, this is absolute gold. 2 DevOps Gigahead answering questions for live for free. Keep up the good work. Thank you. Okay, subscribe. Become a member. Do stuff that you do on YouTube. What is a decent sun for a Kubernetes cluster? We consider DRBD because Ceph is quite hungry. I'm assuming that this is about on-prem. This is you, Scott.
I'm assuming this is on-prem as well. If we're talking on-prem, the best solution for what I would call software-defined storage, so creating really, that underlying element would be, which typically like Rook and Ceph are used for from an open source perspective. The best tool is Portworx, hands down, no questions asked in my mind. They're the small tier, their free tier, whatever that exists is up to like 10 nodes. Like there's some limitations in the free. It is a commercial product that has amazing capabilities to it that are definitely like the leader in the industry in my mind at every single level. However, if you are looking at open source solutions that exist out there, the most common today, I would say, are probably things like OpenEBS or Longhorn or things like that. All of them have their pros. All of them have their cons. They have the different focuses, different feature sets. It really depends on your use case. I'm personally not a fan of Rook and Ceph because I find them to be way too complex to actually manage for a sane human being. Like unless it's packaged in like OpenShift by Red Hat or something like that in their data offering. So I would go with OpenEBS, Longhorn if you had to go open source. If you have the ability to and want, the top brand, I would go for sure with Portworx.
There we go. That's why we have Scott here. He knows stuff that I have no idea. I'm a cloud native. I'm an on-prem refugee. Okay, AKS again. Argo CD is lightweight. One can have one Argo CD instance per app in a cluster. As Argo gets sluggish with load increase, one thinking to have one Argo to rule them all. I would not recommend under any circumstance to have one Argo CD per app. I mean, it's light, but first of all, not that light. Argo CD comes with different components, like nuts that we mentioned before. You get nuts for every single Argo CD instance. It's light, but not that light, first of all. Second, I'm not sure what would be the advantage of that. And
I think there would actually be a huge disadvantage of it,
yeah,
which is the upgrade process when there is, and there will be, a breaking change in the APIs of Argo CD. I wish you all the luck in the world with upgrading Argo CD in tandem, all of them, without breaking Argo CD when there's a breaking change in APIs and all of that. And controller, in the end, you should never have two instances of the same controller in a Kubernetes cluster, I believe, period. Like, it should never exist. If you need it from a tenancy perspective, use vCluster, and inside of vCluster, install the controller, and that will be lighter weight. It'll just a tad overhead, but you never should have two controllers doing the same thing in a cluster.
Yeah, and this is, just to be clear, correct me if wrong, Scott, this is not the grant of not doing it with Argo CD. This applies to anything, right? Don't have
This is
two CMPG. You can have two CMPG clusters, databases, or 5 or 10. You cannot have two CMPG controllers, right?
Exactly.
And Argo CD, now, theoretically, in some future, Argo CD maintainers might choose to actually split it and say, this is the Argo CD machinery, and then this is the part that does the pooling and something like that. Theoretically, I'm not saying that's a good idea. They could do it, but it must be one installation.
Yeah. There's only one tool that I've actually seen that has been built for multi-instance in a cluster. Like Argo CD, you could mention things like sharding and things like that to get better performance if you really wanted to and not make it sluggish. You could deal with sharding and all of that. And then it's still one Argo CD just with multiple replicas with shards and all of that. But the better way, the only tool that I've seen that has gotten this right because of the issue of CRDs is actually a tool called Pinniped, which is an open source like identity tool that came from VMware. That basically, when you install it, the controller installs the CRDs, and you can tell it what you want the suffix of that CRD to be. So I can have, like, they have JWT Authenticator is one of their resources. They have JWT Authenticator pinniped.dev. They also have JWT Authenticator Victor you choose, right? Like, you can do whatever you want, and that way it basically can dynamically set the watchers. It dynamically does all these different elements that make that work. But no one else has implemented that type of an idea. So that's the only one I know that it can work for. Yeah.
And even if you would make Argo CD do that, I still wouldn't see the benefits.
Correct. That there's benefits in specific tools. Argo, I don't see the benefit of that at any level.
The only thing, if Argo CD could be able to do that, if you would have some kind of multi-tenancy based on namespaces, different customers, and you give them each Argo CD and what's not, but then you're definitely looking into multiple clusters, virtual or physical.
Not exactly. At that case, just do vCluster. Like, if you're trying to save, just do vCluster Argo CD inside of that, and yeah.
Okay, this is again on-prem. This is you, Scott. I would like to ask about choosing an operating system for Tanzu cluster, Photon OS or Ubuntu. And this is W. You're the Tanzu person, and you're on-prem person.
Yes. So the answer here depends what version you are on. If you are on a relatively new version, meaning anything basically from the last, I think it's probably like 8 months already, the answer is Photon OS. And what I mean by that is Photon OS 5, yes, container optimized operating system with an up-to-date Linux kernel. If you are on one of the versions of Tanzu, whether that be TKGM, TKGS, or now VKS, or if there's one company that knows how to change names more often than breathe, it is, the Tanzu ecosystem. And so whichever tool you're using, if it is using Photon OS 3, I would not recommend it. It's a very old kernel in there, and that doesn't work with a lot of the industry standard security tools, things like that. If it's Photon OS 5, I believe it's better than Ubuntu. It also comes down to the big question, and which is, if you can have single vendor behind everything, that's a good thing. In AWS, if you use Amazon Linux 2 and you have an issue, 1-800 Amazon, and they are in charge of everything. It's VPC CNI, it's Amazon Linux 2, it's EKS, it's all of this. You have one vendor that dealt with everything. If you're especially in on-prem where you need much more support and you're doing self-managed, that becomes critical. And if you use Ubuntu, then there's another, now you have Canonical in the picture and you have more vendors and all of that. So Photon becomes a major benefit in that world because it is built by VMware, similar to like, whatever, Core OS and Red Hat or all of these, Amazon Linux 2 and Google has theirs and or Bottle Rocket in Amazon as well.
Okay. Next, Nikos, you're on fire. What is your opinion instead to use etcd to use PostgreSQL for Kubernetes? And I'm going to, before you say anything, Scott, I'm going to split it into two potential reasons why Nikos might need this. And there might be third, so let us know, Nikos. One could be potentially performance issues. Another one would be query capabilities. So I'm going to have that as two questions. And I'm going to split those two into half, two more, and say in theory and in practice. I'm making it complicated, I know, but I think it's important, right? So in theory, my 2 cents is, in theory, etcd on larger setup can have serious performance issues. That can be somehow mitigated by giving it more memory, more CPU and all that jazz, right? But it could be an issue, and I've seen semi-successful usages of Postgres for that. For querying capabilities, I think that there are better solutions than to, you should use Kubernetes primarily first as a system of record rather than searchable database, right? That's the primary function. So I'm not very fond replacing it, in theory still, with Postgres or something else because you want better query capabilities, right? You have solutions. I'm actually working on a video about one of those where you can actually synchronize etcd into something else, Postgres or Elastic or whatsoever, and then do the query and all the jazz. No need to replace it. In theory. Now, in practice, don't. Just don't. In practice, don't replace it. Maybe explore options. There are a couple of operating systems. I think that Kubernetes operating systems that come with Postgres instead of etcd. You might choose a different Kubernetes distribution, but don't do it yourself. It's not that trivial.
Exactly.
Scott, all you now.
In general, I believe that yes, some of the major cloud providers do not use etcd in their Kubernetes implementations. However, with that being said, meaning that we know it works. If you look at like K3S and their implementations also, they exist without etcd, or they have the ability of etcd, but there's Kine, which creates that, whatever, the etcd shim above different databases. And yeah, that can work. Do I recommend doing that? The answer is 100% unequivocally no. Do I believe that etcd is the right solution? Unequivocally no. Do I believe it is the required one for a human being to use? The answer is yes. And the reason is that is what Kubernetes is tested against. That is what distributions typically include. That is, in the end, the de facto standard that exists out there. And replacing such a critical path component of Kubernetes, such as etcd, that you have no clue what edge case you're going to run into, which is why I'm against using anything beyond etcd, unless the Kubernetes community go around and say, okay, etcd, it was a good try, we're moving to something else, at which point I would go behind that 100% and would be really happy.
I don't know the exact location, but I know that I've seen there are conversations. There are SIGs that talk about those things, right?
Exactly.
You can join. You can join the effort to replace it. Even kind of like that's all fair game. Just don't do it for your own setup.
Exactly. Don't become a unicorn. Don't become a snowflake. Do what the industry does, which is etcd.
Okay, from Ran, when running lots of stateful apps on Kubernetes, DBs, Minio, etc., does it ever make sense to just install Rook to get around the touch disk limits? Azure Blob not being S3 compatible is frustrating. So this time is cloud. I'm assuming it's not on-prem. I'm not very fond, to be honest, of replacing something as critical as disk from what provider gives me. I feel it's too much trouble.
So this is where I will say, from my perspective, I don't think that Rook actually solves a lot here. I think that, it has a lot of challenges to it. I think that the real benefit here is actually the only solution that I believe really solves this is Portworx. And the reason is that one of the challenges you're going to have with Rook or Longhorn or any of these other solutions is that you have to pre-provision all of that data, right? Like, you need to give those large disks to Rook so that Rook can now go and give me my volumes, right? Like, we have to actually pre-provision it, meaning you're paying for more storage than you need, because if I need to expand, all of a sudden I need to start expanding that and that, whatever. There's autopilot is one of these features, like that I was saying, of the enterprise versions of Portworx, that what it does is it on demand will add more capacity to itself, so it can auto scale and do like thin provisioning and then grow, so you actually save money that way. So
I mean, that's what I meant. If money isn't an
issue, go ahead. But
that's what I was probably not clear what I meant earlier when I say use whatever provider offers you. Does not necessarily has to be Microsoft as a provider, but kind of like, I'm not fond of you installing your own and setting it all up. It's just too much. Yeah. But if you go with Portworx or something like that with their support, yeah.
Exactly. I think all of these things, you want something that support, you want something that is, especially when it's such a critical part. If you're running stateful apps are critical. Their storage is critical. You want support on that storage element, be it the out of the box from the cloud solution, or go with a commercial offering of something that you get support on from a vendor. You don't want to be without support on your storage.
Okay, more from Nikos. What is your criteria for evaluating an app as cloud native? 12-factor apps.
Yep.
There we go. I don't think that where I feel that people make a mistake, is, especially today, is that they start using specific technologies to say this makes it cloud native. Kind of, oh, if it's running in Kubernetes, it's cloud native. No. Think about generic principles, 12-factor, and then we talk about how to implement those principles.
Exactly. You can have a cloud-native app that runs on a Windows server as a process, and you can have a
but you could.
And you can have a monolithic, completely non-cloud native app that's running in a container in Kubernetes. And the two do not it's just, there is a platform that has been built dedicated to run cloud native apps the best way possible. And there is another platform that was built without cloud native apps in mind and was built for legacy apps in mind. Both of them, great solutions, but for different use cases. And the fact they can lap doesn't mean that they should.
And you know what? The parts like technologies like containers, Kubernetes, whatever, they're the easiest part of the problem to solve. Kind of like, that's not a problem at all. Whenever I see companies, it's never that prevents them from being cloud native. It's always the code. Kind of like, if the code of your application is not done in a way that it is stateful, that it does this, that whatever the rules are, you cannot progress. There is nothing. You cannot put you cannot make WebLogic cloud native. There you go. That's the definition.
Correct. You can put WebLogic in Kubernetes. You cannot make it cloud native.
Exactly. Do you have any experience, Scott, with Oracle Cloud? I mean, I have just very, very rudimentary, basic experience, so I'm not good to say much.
Me too. Very basic experience with it. Nothing major.
I know I heard good things from it, but also I know only maybe 3 people in total using it. So.
The only thing that I know about it is, if you run a lot of Oracle databases, probably a good idea to run there because of licensing benefits that you get. Just like if you have a lot of Windows Server, go look at Azure because you get a lot of benefits there in terms of licensing, right? So there are also other reasons to go to Azure. I'm sure there are other reasons to go to Oracle. I just don't know what they would be for Oracle.
Okay, more from Roman now. How do you recommend to manage Kubernetes or EKS add-ons via Argo CD or something else like Helmsman? Do you know what is Helmsman, Scott?
I do not know what Helmsman
I'm Googling
is.
it. Helmsman is a Helm chart as code tool that allows you to automate deployment management of Helm charts for version control. So, I don't know Helmsman, but I will somehow assume that I will have a grudge with it, similar way I have with Helm file.
I already have a grudge with it. It uses a TOML file.
Yeah.
That's a very big grudge that I have with it. Just looking at the README. Yeah.
Now, even though I would never do that, I don't have a big problem with somebody writing something in TOML as a way to generate YAML. But I have a problem with applying TOML directly to cluster. I mean, it cannot be directly, but
you can't.
Some kind of
right.
Yeah, exactly. But kind of make it look like you're applying TOML, right? So, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know Helmsman, so I cannot say much. It feels like it doesn't have a place, to be honest. But I don't know.
No, and in general, I think that any of these tools like Helmfile or Helmsman and all these things that allow you to like wrap around things, they seem very similar to like TerraGrunt is in like the Terraform world, and I don't like those tools either. There is Helm should be used with Helm. Terraform or OpenTofu should be used with Terraform or OpenTofu. I think that any of these tools that try and wrap and make something into what it isn't, I don't like those tools, because then what you do is you end up losing all of the integrations that you get with Helm. It's like so many things plug into Helm. If I start using Helm file, Argo CD doesn't know Helm file. Argo Flux doesn't know Helm file. So now I'm tied into CLI-based approach, right?
Another thing, and this is not based on any information. I don't know what is Helmsman, so I'm just purely guessing. But I have that logic kind of that if you're not happy with Helm, replace it. Do not wrap it. And I'm not now going against Helm or anything like that, but kind of, hey, use Helm. If you don't like it, use something else. Use Customize, use YTT, use KCL. There are a bunch of things that you can replace it with if you don't like it without wrapping it up.
Yeah.
Okay, Mohammed, what is the best way to run pipeline to build Docker images on premise without connection to public internet? And I will make slight modification of the question, correction. I like saying container images. We don't make Docker images. We can just use Docker to create container images, and container images can be created with many different tools.
Yes.
But that being said, without connection to public internet, basically, that means that you need to have your base images and your application dependencies and everything in your own registry. That's the only way around it. But once you do, building is just Docker image build, or whichever tool you're using to build.
Exactly. I mean, typically what we like to do is, I believe that in most environments, there is some gateway into the air-gapped environment without access to the public internet and all of that. And the way that we typically like to set this up is that you have Harbor at one end that has access to the internet, that you use basically as like a proxy cache that brings in images, that replicates images from the public into your environment. That then you have another harbor that you have access to that pulls from that. So you actually have like a middleman. You have two harbors. And what you do is you set the internal harbor to pull from the external one based off of rules, though, because you can say that whenever an image gets pushed to that external facing harbor, it has to be scanned, and only images that don't have a vulnerability above X can even be pulled. and then only those will make it in. You could say only signed images, and then you have to sign them in that external harbor before they make it in. So you can do things that way. Now, the one thing that people don't think about also when it comes to building on-prem without public internet is that it is not just the container image. It's not just the from statement. You obviously, and if you're working without public internet, packages, so you have to have your own app repositories. If you're building a Java app, you have to have Artifactory or whatever that you're going to manage all of that has to be dealt with, but that's no different in a Docker file or a container file if you use Podman or build packs or 20,000 other tools than it would be if you weren't in a container. So whatever you use there, use here.
You can think of it, this is nothing to do with container images. You have certain dependencies that you need to download from somewhere. And those dependencies can come in 50 different variations, including dependent images.
Exactly.
Okay, should I use one tilt file per microservice or one for all of them? Correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, you use tilt file, right? Or yeah. I don't like doing that, but tilt, maybe there is a reason to do it.
Yeah, so I do like tilt. I think that tilt works really well when you have multiple microservices that you want to deploy together and you want to, just be like debugging one of them, but you want them all running and get all the logs and you can restart controllers and all that. Like if you want to see what in my mind is probably the best implementation of tilt is go and look at any of the cluster API providers and how that has been built out. I do not believe that tilt per each microservice, unless you are developing. The scope of a tilt file should be what you want deployed and running in order for you to debug and write your code, is basically the scoping here. So if to work on microservice A, you need B and C deployed, then A, B, and C should be in the same tilt file. If you can deploy and manage A on its own completely and don't want B and C there as the visualization above A, as a backend for A instead of writing a mock or something like that, then go and use a tilt file. Like that's basically just the logic.
I could, an evil person, not me, could actually argue that the scenario that you just explained, that's a distributed monolith. It's not microservices, but
I would disagree with that, though, because if you have a front end and you have a back end, and I am working on the back end, what you do want is probably the front end deployed so that you make sure that you didn't break something, or you want to see the new data that you added in, how it's visualizing in the UI. Or if I'm not saying dependency between, but what you do have is relations between one another that you want to validate.
But then we agree, kind of, but that's limited in number, right? We're not talking about hundreds of them being required. Okay, cool.
No, but it is, for example, tilt.
Kind of few direct dependencies.
Right, and it should deploy, for example, let's say Nats or RabbitMQ or Kafka or Postgres using like a Helm chart and preload it with. You should be able to get your environment through a tilt file. Whatever that environment means, that is what tilt should create and destroy. Same thing goes if you're using Scaffold. Same thing goes if you're using other tools. Like today, I'm more in the dev pod world myself and dev containers. So I would go down that approach. Same thing there as you would in tilt. So I think any of these tools, it's the same thing.
But just to make, and I don't know whether we disagree, don't make one tilt file or one something for the whole system, like 100 applications or something like that, because then...
Unless they are a distributed monolith and that is what your environment is, and then the answer is yes. But it's whatever environment means to you for development to be able to actively and productively test your development in a sane manner.
Yeah, that we agree. The reason why I was saying what I was saying is that I've seen many times that in an attempt to simplify things for everybody, let me change the subject. Let's say one Jenkins file instead of tilt file, just to make a difference, right? And then people would be creating a single one that serves everybody purpose, kind of in an attempt to make it easier. But then that one ends up having all the permutations. Huh?
Right. With 75,000 conditionals inside.
Exactly.
And
parameters.
Code. Right. Complete spaghetti code. Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, you end up having more parameters that you need to tweak to get something than to write that something yourself.
Right.
When you reach that part,
right. If POM.xml exists, do this. If Gradle exists, do this. If JavaScript, do this. If Python, do this. Create a Go pipeline, create a Java pipeline, create this. Maybe you create a wrapper pipeline that does that, figure out what logic, and then calls the other ones, but don't mix the code together. And you can do that, by the way, in Tilt as well. Tilt, you can import other Tilt files into your Tilt file. So if you have those use cases, then you can build meta Tilt files above different subsystems.
We're at the top of the hour, so let's do very, very quick one. Yes, no type of stuff. Do you guys know any tool like Packer or Atlantis equivalent to Packer? I don't.
It's the one tool that wasn't for.
Exactly. The rest are not really questions. Let me see. Customize all the way for internal apps. Yeah, cool. I mean,
YTT.
KCL. Okay, then if you're putting our votes, and the last one is also a comment, not really a question. Thank you so much for watching. See you next week. Write us your questions again. We'll do our best to answer. Cheers.
Cheers.